What's up, everybody? I'm Adam. You're watching Model Aviator, and if you follow the channel, first of all, we really appreciate it. Thank you. But you've probably seen a video that we did. You'll recognize this airplane. The video we did before was called Swap Meet Heaven. It's about our trip to the Southeastern Model Show in Perry, Georgia, also known as the Perry Swap Meet. It is the largest RC aircraft swap meet in the country. Very, very impressive. We picked up a lot of cool things there. This is but one of them. You'll see the maiden flight in that video of this airplane. This is a Jim Ryan Bearcat. Now, I knew it was a Bearcat when I picked it up, but I didn't know it was a Jim Ryan Bearcat. Didn't know who Jim Ryan was. There's a cool story in that video about finding out who Jim Ryan is. Turns out he is one of the pioneers of small electric warbirds back in the 90s when they were still using brushed geared motors and NiCad batteries, really heavy battery packs, and he made airplanes that actually flew well on that stuff. And as it turns out, he now offers laser cut kits, updated designs made for brushless motors and LiPo batteries, which is what we're running our old Jim Ryan Bearcat on. And the interesting thing about that video too is if you check out the comment section, you'll notice that Jim Ryan himself started a comment, and we had a conversation. A lot of people commented to Jim. Jim gave me some insight into what I needed to do to make this airplane fly better than I had it flying after he watched my flight and saw how I had it set up. He advised me to go to a smaller regular E-prop from the slow flyer prop that I had, move up from 2-cell to 3-cell, which really gave this airplane some punch, but with less torque, which kind of helped the way that it flew since it's bank and yank. There's no active rudder. He also gave me some advice as to my elevator throw. I had a bit too much. I tend to have a lot more throw than most. Calming the throw down really helped on this particular airplane. Didn't need as much as I had anywhere near to make it do what you'd want to do with something like this. So what you're going to see today is not only updated flight footage, but something even cooler than that. The flight footage will be at the end. Right now, when we leave the bench, you're going to see an interview with Jim Ryan. He agreed to do an interview with Model Aviator via Google Meet. Super interesting gentleman. Still designs airplanes to this day. He still writes for magazines to this day. He's written for RC flying magazines for years, including Model Aviation. That, for those of you that don't know, is the magazine that we get with our subscription to, or our membership to the AMA here in the States. And just a very, very interesting gentleman. He's old school. He likes balsa planes. He likes warbirds. He gives kind of his insight into what he thinks of foamies, who he thinks makes the best airplanes out there today, you know, the best foam airplanes, explains why he still likes to fly and design balsa, tells you about his new laser cut kits that are available with updated designs for brushless motors and LiPos, and where you can get them, and even gives us a little information, kind of an exclusive, I guess you could say, as to what he's got on the drawing board and what he'll be coming out with. It'll be brand new very soon. So check this interview with Jim Ryan out. I learned a lot from this gentleman just talking to him. I think you will too. Very, very cool man. Interesting character, as we find in RC. That's the fellowship is great. And now we've got the interweb, so we can get in touch with people from overseas and folks like Jim Ryan that we've never met, who lives in Ohio, and have a conversation from hundreds of miles away. It's really cool. Check that out, and then check out the updated flight footage of our Jim Ryan Bearcat, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Take care. I'm here with Jim Ryan. I want everybody to meet Jim Ryan with Jim Ryan Aircraft.
Hi, Adam. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Thanks for doing this. Really, really appreciate it. It's amazing that a comment section could lead to this. Pretty cool.
Yeah, it was really neat catching up with all the guys that chimed in on comments on your video, and I really enjoyed seeing you scare that thing up at the swap meet.
Yeah, it was quite a little acquisition. I had no idea what I had a hold of until my buddy John with Just Wing It got a hold of a few people that instantly recognized what it was. And I know there's a couple of guys out west that are chomping at the bit to see this interview. So they'll be very, very happy to see this.
Terrific.
All right. So I guess we'll just get started. So the first question that I have for you is, how long have you been in model aviation, and who or what inspired you to get in it?
Well, I found out about radio control back in the mid 70s when an RC mag was misdelivered to my parents' house. And I read it from cover to cover, and I was just fascinated. I particularly remember it had an interview with Dave Platt, and he was talking about back when he built the models that they used in the movie The Battle of Britain in 1968, and how he had to invent the process of weathering to make them look like real airplanes in flight. And I thought that was just fascinating stuff. So I started buying like Model Airplane News and RCM at the grocery store. And there were so many great writers in those magazines that really inspired me. See, I lived in rural Missouri, so I didn't know anybody who flew RC. So I was kind of on my own. So I really wanted to get into radio control, but this was the mid 70s, and a good radio was like $400 back then, which is like $1,900 in today's money. So, you know, a teenager couldn't really swing that. So I got a 2-channel radio. I did a little bit of half-A stuff, but I didn't really stick with it, and I went off to college and did other things. But then about 10 years later, Tim Schmeitz, a friend of mine to this day, who was an engineer for a customer I was a supplier to, got into RC, and he started explaining how much more accessible it had gotten, that the radios were a lot cheaper and more reliable. And it so happened that the little town that my plant was based in had a thriving little group flying radio control. So I got in with those guys and started flying, and that was about 1988.
Wow, what a cool story. What an awesome by chance happening for a model aviation magazine to land on your doorstep, and you grab a hold of that thing and go, ooh.
Yeah, it really unlocked a whole new view to me.
That is awesome. Well, how did you get into designing your own model aircraft?
Well, from the day I first soloed, I wanted to build World War II fighters. And back then, warbirds had a reputation for being heavy and unforgiving, but I was determined to do it. So I bought a top flight P-47, but honestly, that kit was just awful. It was heavy. The wing design was a mess. So I used the parts of that I could scavenge and more or less scratch built an airplane to the same outline. And it came out looking great, but it was just too heavy. And right then, that was 1992, I moved to Cincinnati, and my current club, GCRCC, is really active. And there was a bunch of guys flying warbirds every weekend. So suddenly I saw you could do it, you know, that mine was just too heavy. And if I did some things better, it would work. So I designed a BF-109 was my next model, and it was nice and light, but I didn't choose a good airfoil, and it had kind of poor stall characteristics. So that was my next lesson I learned, is that airfoils really matter. And so after that, I built a 65-inch Mustang that, with retracts and flaps and drop tanks, still weighed barely over 8 pounds, you know, a 60-size Mustang. And I built it with a Clark-Y airfoil, and it flew like a Cub. It was like nothing else in our club, how slowly it could fly. And about that same time, I designed a B-29, a 12-foot span B-29 that I built with a close friend of mine, Paul Conrad, who's like one of the nicest guys in the known universe. And it came out under 30 pounds, which was like 20 pounds lighter than any other B-29 I'd ever seen. And it flew like a high-performance sailplane. And 25 years later, Paul's still flying it. So from then on, I wanted to scratch build everything, and that's mostly what I've done in all the years since.
Man, that's good. And to hear that your friend's still flying that airplane 25 years, that just goes to show you, if you take care of your stuff and you outfit it with good equipment and you have some flying skill, you know, they don't all have an expiration date necessarily.
Absolutely.
Yep, that's cool. So what model magazines have you written for, and how did you end up landing that job?
Well, I've mostly written for Model Airplane News and Model Aviation, the AMA magazine, and that started when I first got into electric flight in 1995. I learned about electric power from a bunch of really smart guys on CompuServe. Remember them? And they explained how electric power worked, and I decided I wanted to give it a try. The thing is, with the NICADs that were all we had back then, you had to get everything just right to even get a 5-minute flight, which was kind of the gold standard. You wanted your airplane to fly for 5 minutes. And anyone with any sense would have started out with a basic sport model, but I decided to scratch build a Hellcat. And I'd never even seen an electric airplane fly at that point, so they all thought I was out of my mind. And to be fair, it didn't work out the first time, and I had to build a couple scale models and then sport models, and then I built my P-38, and that was my first big success. And I remember I took it to KRC, the KRC event in Pennsylvania in 1996, and Larry Marshall, the editor of Model Airplane News, said, you should write a construction article about this. So that started out. I started out doing construction articles, and then eventually started writing, how-tos. I did a column for a number of years, and it's time consuming, but I really love the tech writing aspect. It's kind of added a dimension to the hobby.
Yeah, I can imagine. I know some of the people that in the comments have read some of your articles, some of your build articles, and that's where they heard about you. So how did all this end up being a business for you?
Well, you have to know that in the 90s, there were hardly any small scale models for electric power. And I think that's partly why my designs got popular so quickly, because they filled this vacuum. And as soon as the P-38 and then the Hellcat construction articles were published, I was offering foam wing cores, and I was spending weekends cutting cores, hundreds of them. And people kept pestering me to offer kits. And it happened that back then, SIG Manufacturing would do custom laser cutting. So I had SIG laser cut the parts. I cut the foam cores myself. I vacuum formed my own canopies and was packing kits in my business, in my basement. And it just kind of took off, and was pretty busy for a number of years.
That is really, really cool. What an interesting way to you just kind of fell into it. Just kind of people wanted it and you got after it. That's pretty cool. That's a neat story. How do you decide what to design and market?
I got to tell you, Adam, I'm not real market driven. I always pick my next project from whatever I want to build. There's a saying in the kit business that if you want to be successful, you should offer a Mustang and a Cub. And I've never offered a kit for either of those. Radial engine warbirds are my favorites, and that's mostly what I've designed.
That's cool. I know John, the gentleman that helped me identify the Bearcat, has one of your Wildcats, and he was going to visit for Seth. We didn't get to do it this year. Seth is coming up this week, and hopefully we can get his Wildcat and my Bearcat together at some time for a video. That'd be very, very cool. So do you remember what year you designed that Bearcat I've got?
Oh, absolutely. It was 1997. Once I got the Hellcat flying, I kind of broke the mold for Speed 400 systems by running 8 cells on a 6-volt motor. The conventional wisdom was that you couldn't do that you'd burn up the motor, but I decided to try it, and it turned out the motor would last about 100 flights or more before it wore out. And it was the front bushing that would wear out, not the brushes or the commutator. So with all that extra power I had, I immediately wanted to build a Bearcat because it's such a high performance aircraft.
Right.
And it's just always one of my favorite airplanes. The one thing that concerned me is the Bearcat's got a big old cowl, and with a Speed 400 motor, you're limited to a 6-inch prop. And I was afraid I wouldn't have enough prop outside the cowl for it to fly well. So I honestly had low enough expectations that I covered the prototype with Ultracoat, whereas I normally fiberglass and paint my airplanes. But I remember I stayed up way late one night to finish the prototype, and I took it to an electric fly in Indianapolis and did the maiden flight, and I immediately knew it was the best airplane I'd ever designed. It just flew like it was on rails from the start. And so I immediately started building another one to fiberglass and paint. And that airplane was like an old friend from the very first flight. I just loved it.
Man, that is cool. So I guess that is the best flying airplane you've ever designed, the Bearcat.
I would have to say, so. Years ago, there was an article in Flight Journal where the great aviation writer Jeff Ethel got to fly a Bearcat, and he said that years earlier he had interviewed Neil Armstrong, and he wanted to know what his favorite airplane was that he ever flew. And before he even got the question out of his mouth, Neil goes, "Bearcat," and and he just insisted that of all the amazing airplanes he'd flown over his long career, there was just nothing else like a Bearcat. And my model's been like that. All these airplanes that I design have the same airfoil, about the same wing area, the same power system. But for some reason, the Bearcat just seemed to fly better than the rest. I think maybe it's the relatively large horizontal stab that it has that makes it hold the line so well. Or maybe I'm just being biased because I love Bearcat.
Well, nothing wrong with the Bearcat. There's something I notice about every Bearcat model and every T-28 model, and they have something in common. They both have big wings and they both have really big empennage. And you can't find one that doesn't fly well, it seems like. Every Bearcat, every T-28 model that you find, they fly good. And especially, yeah, they're really something else. So in today's world, it's a little different. The really popular stuff now is EPO. What company would you say, of all the companies like Horizon Hobby and Motion RC and Hobby King, who do you think is bringing the best models to market in the modern era?
Okay, well, let me start by saying I kind of have mixed feelings about the explosion of foamies. On the one hand, they've made it possible for people to have immediate success and to fly the cool scale models that I always loved. And with foam, you can do shapes and forms that would be really hard to do with balsa. But all that said, an EPO model is kind of temporary. Even if you take really good care of them, they gradually get a lot of surface rash or just flat out wear out. Like if it's a high performance model, the wing will get a little spongy. These four models here are all at least 20 years old, and one of them is 24, and they all have hundreds of flights on them. You're just not going to do that with a foam airplane. They're kind of temporary. But all that said, there are some companies putting out really well engineered EPO models. The foamies of today are an order of magnitude better than just 10 years ago. Horizon makes some really great stuff. That little 1.2 meter T-28 of theirs is just a fun airplane. And they've just now re-released it with some improvements. I think they put safe and some other features like that on it. So it's great to see that on the market. And it's got flaps and retracts too, on top of being just a fun airplane to fly. I mean, what's not to love? Horizon drives me a little crazy because they suddenly pull models off the market without any warning. And I kind of feel like if I like a model of theirs, I should buy a spare and stuff it in the storeroom.
Oh, you are so right. They are bad about doing that. I've told everybody, if there's something you like at Horizon, go ahead and get it. And if you really like it, go ahead and buy a backup.
Buy two.
Because, yep, for sure.
And there's a bunch of other good suppliers. FMS stands out, and they make all those terrific jets that are just plug and play. I mean, buy an F-18 and fly it this afternoon. That's pretty awesome. And in the sport aerobatic segment, I am really impressed with Kike's company, Flex Innovations. They make some terrific models. The engineering and flight performance are just perfect, which I guess is what you'd expect from a guy as meticulous as Kike. But his models really deserve more attention than they get.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of time. They're starting to get into the EDFs, and I think that's going to make them a lot more popular. But you're right, Kike is one of my favorite designers of all time. I've owned a bunch of stuff that he's designed, and I agree with what you say about the foam models having kind of a shelf life, especially a high performance model. We did a video where we're comparing a foam 3D plane with a balsa 3D plane, and I can already feel the foam airplane, the airframe getting tired, doesn't fly the same way, feels different. And I put hundreds and hundreds of flights on balsa 3D planes from like Extreme Flight 3D Hobby Shop, and they just last and last and last. So that's definitely true. Unless you take care of it, you're not going to have a foam airplane that's going to fly the same for 20 years for sure. So
Agreed.
that's interesting. So, uh, what is your favorite plane in your hangar to fly currently?
Well, there's not a simple answer to that because I fly helicopters a lot as well. For fixed wing, that checker tail P-47 up there is a favorite. Honestly, I don't fly it as often as I'd like to because I put way too much effort into painting it. uh, and then for a relaxed, easy plane, my T-28, the Horizon T-28 is awesome. I take that to the field just about every time I go. For helicopters, the Loach here over my shoulder is my absolute favorite. That thing's 10 years old, and I've got to have 400 flights on it. If I go to the field, I always take it with me. And it's got presence in the air, and it even has that kind of cool turbine whine to it. So I really love that machine as well.
Man,
But you know,
that's
I got to be honest. Even after thinning the herd some over the last few years, I still have over 50 airplanes and helicopters. So favorite is a relative term.
I can relate, man. We especially since we started the channel, we've got limited room, and we have creatively taken up all of it. Anytime we bring something new in to review, I've got to figure a place to put it, and usually it's something that we're borrowing from somebody's letting us use it, and it's a good thing because I don't have a place to keep it permanently. You seem to have a lot of airplanes and helicopters that have a lot of years on them, as do I, and I keep hearing this. It drives me crazy for people in the hobby to say that something has an expiration date. I just don't think that has to be true. How is it that you have airplanes and helicopters for 20 or 30 years and they don't have an expiration date miraculously?
You maintain an airplane or particularly a helicopter because helicopters eat up spare parts. You maintain them like you should a full-size aircraft. You wouldn't fly a Cessna 172 year after year without ever doing an annual on it. You should annual your models in the same way. My
That's
friend Keith
exactly.
Shaw has several airplanes that are over 40 years old that he flies regularly.
Wow, that's something else. And that's exactly what I do. I take airplanes apart, take the canopy off, take the cowling off, look for cracks around the battery trays and things like that. You especially a high performance airplane. I do an annual on my 3D planes every single year just because of the stress they're under. And I do the scale planes probably every 2 or 3 years. And it's amazing what you find when you look under the hood and really pay attention to the things that you catch. That if you didn't catch it, it's just a matter of time, and that's going to cost you the airplane. That's
I particularly
right.
annual my big helicopters and the Loach here over my shoulder. A couple of years ago, I pulled the mechanics completely out of the body and go over it from nose to tail. And I found that one of the bevel gears in the tail had split. Now there's a pin through it on the shaft, but it had split at that pin. And it was only a matter of time till that gear just split completely apart. And if I hadn't pulled the mechanics out and looked it over, I never would have seen that.
Yep, yep. It's amazing the things you catch when you're paying attention. And pre-flight checks. That's another thing that just routine, making sure that all your linkages, every clevis is hooked to every control horn properly. Every screw is tight. Your servo arm screws. I've seen guys lose airplanes just because they don't pay attention to simple stuff like that. And I check it before every flight.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yep. So finally, I don't want to take too much of your time. You have some new models that are either available now or they're going to be available pretty soon. Tell us about those, what's available, where to get it, and if you can give us a scoop on anything that you might be coming out with pretty soon. I'm sure people would love to hear that.
Okay. Well, the kit business dried up about 2007, and I went from selling hundreds a year to like 2 or 3 a month. And my supply chain got more difficult. Lead times were longer. Parts would show up cut wrong and that kind of thing. So I finally pulled the plug back then. But over the years, I found that buddies of mine and fellow designers like Jim Young and Denny Sumner, Pat Tridle, were all having their designs kitted by Manzano Laser Works. And so finally, I reached out to Tom Jacoby, and who now owns the company, and we agreed that he'd start offering my kits. And I'm really tickled that he already has pre-orders when they're not quite ready yet. He probably will be shipping kits by the time this video is ready to
That's awesome.
air.
That is cool.
I can't recommend Manzano LaserWorks highly enough. If you go on there, you see scores of different kits that are all available, and he basically makes them to order. He doesn't carry inventory. If you want a model, he makes it for you and ships it. And that business model allows him to offer a huge variety of designs by some of the best designers in the world. And so spend some time at Manzano LaserWorks. Tom does some amazing stuff. You asked about new stuff. I do have some designs in the work now that I'm partnered up with Tom. Years ago, I had drawn a 1/16 scale PBM, which is the same scale as my Corsair and my P-47. But the Avenger is such a big airplane that it'd be big enough for small electric retracts. And so I really want to build that. It'll take some work getting all the vacuum forming tooling made. But honestly, I have about 5 different projects now that are about half finished, and I should probably push a couple of those over the finish line before I start something new. But I would expect that TBM to be the next thing that Tom would release.
That's awesome. I know a lot of people will be excited about that. There's quite a few people that I follow on YouTube that have YouTube channels. One that comes to mind is Cliff Harvey. He likes to build. He's not into the foam stuff, and he's always taking the Gwillows free flight airplanes and turning those into RCs, and he gets kits. I'm quite sure that there'll be a Jim Ryan kit in Cliff's future after he sees this. That's going to be very, very cool.
I love the foam models are great for what they are. And by the way, there are some really good wood ARFs as well. I mean, Horizon like that. They're Stearman, they're little Taylor craft. They have done some great models over the years that are built up wood models that are covered with film. But for me, designing and building has always been at least half my enjoyment of the hobby. And you can build all winter long, when you can't be out flying. So I really encourage people, if you've never done a kit, give it a go. You might find that you'll like it more than you think.
Yeah, I think that's really a good thing to do. I try to tell everybody that gets in the hobby, build a kit, because you go on, different forums and you read people complaining about the hard build of some foamy that takes 2 hours, and they're like, man, I can't believe it took 2 hours with so many wires. And I'm sitting there thinking, man, you have no idea how good you've got it. Build the kit and then tell me how hard putting that 2-hour foamy is. Yeah.
But there's nothing like that accomplishment of the first time you fly an airplane that you built yourself. When I got started, that was your only option. You had to build your airplane. But the fact that building an airplane and making it fly is a great feeling. And if you scratch build something, it's even that much better.
Yep, yeah, I agree. That's when I started in the 80s. That was it. I think ARFs were just starting to come out, but they were terrible. The first ARFs were not good at all in the 80s. I think I started about 83. So yeah, built my first Sig Cadet. That was what I started with, a Claude McCullough design. But man, well, Jim, thank you so much for taking the time on a Sunday to sit down and talk to us. I know the viewers are really, really going to be excited about seeing this interview and what you've got coming out and what you have. So thanks so much.
Thanks very much. It's been a lot of fun. I look forward to next time.
All right, man. Sounds good. We'll do that.
Yeah, or turn them on.
much closer than that, could I?